came up just the other day that I wanted to talk about for a second. Zoe was looking at classes that were offered for the next semester, and one of the classes was the Bible as literature. And I remembered when those classes would be offered, I think a lot of evangelicals get up in arms because they say, oh, treating the Bible as literature means that we're somehow not treating it as inspired, and so it's just a book, and we're going to examine it like we would Shakespeare or some other work of literature, and that's somehow demeaning to the Bible. And there might be something to that, depending on how it's viewed. But I think there's a tendency for us as evangelicals, take the Bible seriously. There's a tendency to treat it as more of an encyclopedia. That is, I'm going to look up something. I want to look up anger. I'm dealing with anger, so I'm going to look up all the verses. Like there's an article on anger in the Bible, and I'm going to look that up. Or I'm going to look at love, or I'm going to look up how to be patient, or something like that. And the Bible we treat it like it's an encyclopedia, a reference book. And that's not exactly bad, but it's also not particularly good, because I think we can miss out on things. We can miss out on the Bible as literature. When we look at it as a reference book, we miss out on the idea that it is written as literature, and the people who are writing the Bible are thinking like that, and they're using all these literary techniques to make a point. And the point that I would like to make today is about the words I just used, bad and good. What does that mean in the Bible? And we can start in Genesis. Genesis chapter 1, there's all these passages where God creates a thing and he says, oh, that's good. And then he creates another thing and that's good. And it's repeated every day in the 7 days, or the 6 days of creation. Then on the 7th day he says, very good. So what Genesis chapter 1 is hammering home to us is that God is the one who determines what is good. So he's the one who says it's good. And if he says it's good, it's good. And we leave it to him to make that determination. So then in Genesis 3, what does the serpent do? He says, is God really the one who decides what is good and what is bad? Eve, you can do that. You can decide what is good and bad. And Eve takes the bait. And she looks at the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, and she says, wow, that's good. It's the same word. And that's what I want to point out. Using the literary device of repeating a certain word in certain key moments in the story is supposed to draw our mind back to Genesis chapter 1 and who is the one who determines what is good. So in Genesis 3, Eve looks at the fruit and says, that's good. And then she takes it, and obviously, bad things happen, right? She was the one who took it upon herself to decide what is good. So that idea of what is good and who is the decider of what is good, we already see it played out. It started in Genesis 1, and we see what happens when we decide what's good in Genesis 3. And let's go to Genesis chapter 4. And this is the story of Cain and Abel. And Cain gave an offering that God didn't look upon with favor, and Abel did, and so Cain is mad. And what does God say to him in Genesis 4? He says, hey, listen, Cain, if you do well, won't your face be lifted up? So what does that do well? That is the verb form of good. It's doing good. If you do well, then good things will happen to you. So there it is. We see it again. This again as a literary device. If we were to read this all in English, and we kind of we get a little confused in English because it's doing well versus good, but it's the same word or the same root word in the Hebrew, right? And we can look this up in a concordance, and we have all these tools to figure this out. And that's what I did. I just looked up the word good, and where are all the places that we see the word good? So we see it right there in Genesis 4. God is saying, you do well, and this good thing will happen to you. But he obviously doesn't, and then bad things happen. So now let's skip to Genesis chapter 6. The sons of God, it says, saw the daughters of women were attractive. That's what it says in the ESV that I'm reading. But guess what? What's the word behind attractive? It's the word good. So again, we see somebody who's not God making the determination of what is good. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were good, and then they took them to wives, and terrible things happened. By the time you get to verse 5, Genesis 6:5, every thought was only evil all the time. So there's the bad. So they decided what was good, and we end up with things being bad. So do you see the rhythm? Who decides what's good? God does. When we decide what's good, bad things happen. So let's skip. Oh, one more thing. Genesis 24 with the servant of Abraham and Rebekah. Look in verse 16, and this is your homework assignment. What is God saying in that passage about what is good? And what is the author of Genesis trying to tell us about Rebekah in that story? So that's your little extra credit assignment you can do. But let's skip to the last two ones I want to bring up are in Exodus. So we skipped out of Genesis and we're in Exodus. The children of Israel are in bondage. They're slaves to Pharaoh, and they're expanding. And so Pharaoh says to the Hebrew midwives, "Hey, I want you to kill all the male children." But they don't do that. They disobey, and they let the male children live. And what does God say in Exodus chapter 1? He dealt well with the Hebrew midwives because they did this. Yes, it's the same word. He did good to them. So there it is again. God is now doing good to somebody, and so we can see that he is honoring what the midwives are doing by he is doing good to them. The last one is just in the next chapter, Exodus 2. We find that there's a woman, a wife of a Levite. She's a daughter of Levi herself, and she has a child. She gives birth to a male child, and she looks on him, and she says, it says in the ESV, it's a fine baby. And you guessed it. What's the word there? What's the word for fine baby? It's good. It's the same word all the way back to Genesis 1. She's looking at that baby and says it's a good baby. And like the King James says, it was a goodly child. So there it is. It's a good baby. And so the question, of course, is her assessment right? I mean, is that impartial? Is God saying this baby's a good baby? Or is it kind of like Eve looking at the fruit and her deciding it's good? And the rest of the story of Exodus is us figuring that out. Again, this is a story. This is the Bible as literature, and we get to experience that now because maybe we've heard the story of Moses and we know he's a good guy, but remember, he doesn't start that way. He gets adopted into Pharaoh's family, and he's going around. He killed somebody and is being chased out of Egypt as a murderer. That is not a good story, right? So we have to have the redemption of Moses. And is he good? In the end, of course, we find out that he is. But that's the story. And it is a story. So when we look at the Bible as literature, and that doesn't mean that it's not also inspired, that it's not the words of God, but if we look at it as a crafted piece of literature that's designed to tell us something by even the words that it's using, I think we get even more out of the text.